Howdy of you delicious people. I am here today to go over Final Girl. So reasonably within this review, we not only have Final Girl, but then we also have another movie called The Final Girls. If you've ever seen that movie, it's kind of really interesting. I always talk about Final Girl and The Final Girls together, but ultimately you can see the title of this movie right here. Check out The Final Girls if you want. Ultimately, you can find it because recently it's a last action hero kind of movie where ultimately a group of people end up getting infused into being in a film that ultimately stars a person that had previously passed away. It's a very interesting story. It kind of has a Friday the 13th kind of like feel through it. It's really fun, and ultimately go ahead and enjoy it if you like the Final Girls. But I'm here today to talk about Final Girl. So Final Girl is a movie you can see on Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie and TV service. At the end of the day, you could say that you saw any number of things besides Final Girl. You could probably see any number of things like Double Dragons or any number of things that you would probably see through that. I think lately I've kind of tapered away from doing Tubi because ultimately you used to see a lot of stuff in there all the time, a lot of retro films, a lot of just interesting stuff that I wouldn't have been able to see anywhere else. So go ahead and check out Tubi, Tubi. So Final Girl. What is Final Girl? Well, it's a really interesting movie that I actually really was like, man, I'm so happy that I found this film, and ultimately, I'm so happy to be able to talk about it again because I felt that I had to. Because recently, this review from my other channel was like, you know what? I think I will probably have to redo this one. Um, so here we are. We ultimately have Abigail Breslin, who ultimately is in the movie Zombieland. If you guys remember Zombieland, you could probably know her. We have Alexander Ludwig, who ultimately a lot of people will probably know him much more from the very first Hunger Games. There's a lot of characters within this movie that at some point you can find and just go, oh yeah, I remember him from this movie. Wes Bentley ultimately plays William in this film, and ultimately, if you've ever seen the movie Ghost Rider, he's in that film. So, in a cryptic like sense, what is this movie about? So, reasonably, we have a girl from a very young age being adopted by William, and what ends up happening is this guy ends up training this girl for years, adopting her and training her for years to consistently play a damsel in distress. And you're going to say, what? Well, here's the thing. She'll play a damsel in distress, but that will all be a facade. Because really, she has been training for years to kill guys twice her size, deck everybody, and it's just awesome. Consistent training that she has been getting for years to otherwise take down anybody, and I mean anybody. Uh, we have Abigail that really has to consistently investigate, get little knowledge about somebody, but then also eventually see how exactly she is going to fall into this trap that she set for someone else. Because reasonably, we have William that has kind of done the investigating and ultimately figured out exactly where it seems like all these people are coming from, all these dead people. that it seems are all cold cases because they can't figure, like, none of the detectives can figure out how to narrow down where these deaths are coming from originally, but William can figure that out, and so ultimately William sends Veronica out to see if she can snag anybody to eventually take them all out, which eventually she will at some point. So I thought that this was really intriguing. I thought that how Abigail, especially, like, once she finally, like, is being, like, in Rambo mode and going after all these guys, and especially the real fight out towards the end, I was like, this is awesome. You have, like, Veronica or Abigail that is ultimately just like, yeah, I like, she's cracking her knuckles and, like, basically like, yeah, let's go. Like, I've been waiting for this all night long. I've been waiting to take you out. This is fun for me. I'm excited. And reasonably, like, that is a selling point. If they could take that ending scene in a trailer and showcase that, that would actually sell this movie more so than anything else. Because basically, you have this girl that's like, yeah, I've trained for you, I've prepared for you, let's go. Instead of having Jameson, who is the guy from Hunger Games, going like, haha, yeah, we're gonna get her, we're gonna take her down as per usual. And it's not gonna happen that way. Or is it? So anyways, there's a little bit of confusing points that I will talk about in this movie. I think the second time around, I think this cleared a little bit of things up more than it did the first time. So I guess it's good that I went over this again because it's like, okay, I didn't quite understand the whole, like, part where they got really afraid, every single one of them, or what their greatest fear was. I was a little confused about that moment. So, anyways, let's get into me talking more about this cryptically. So we ultimately have a group of guys that otherwise, per when they find their girl, they eventually end up all wearing tuxedos bizarrely, and then go in the middle of nowhere and ultimately run after her or hunt her. It seems like they have used a barrage of weaponry at points. Ultimately, it supposedly has confused the police. So it's not like they just would all have firearms or all have uh, like hacksaws or all have chainsaws all at the same time, because no, there needs to be some confusion of how someone dies. Justifiably enough, it seems like the person that usually chooses these girls, they all have to look the same. They all have to have blonde hair. They all have to seemingly be very attractive. And ultimately, I guess you would have to assume that reasonably they all collect them at the same diner. So that's what you'd have to naturally assume about these people. So I think it's about that time to talk about this in a very spoiler-like sense. So let's break out the bubbly, I guess, and go into the final girl. Spoiler time. Spoiler time. About the time. Spoil. So yeah, I've kind of teed this up a little bit. So recently, orphan girl who ultimately gets trained by a trainer named William to like have survival training for years. Basically, he mentions every single thing that he has ever done to her, Veronica, and eventually he also trains her on things here and there. He ends up training her how to choke him until the life seemingly snuffs out of him, and ultimately he ends up training her on being at this very small uh, rock that is by the water, and William gives Veronica a gun and tells her to shoot him. She shoots him. There is no bullets. There's nothing in the chamber, so to speak. William is telling her to stand there and don't move because ultimately she needs to learn how to end up seemingly being at the worst scratching of the edge, and that ultimately a gun is really nothing. If a gun is even pointed at her, like, there's always a way out of it. So we have Veronica, who also has to take a cocktail of sorts. Ultimately, William is strapping her into this bed of sorts, and ultimately William is going to give her a cocktail that is going to show her greatest fear. And he ultimately tells her that it's like, well, this will feel like an entire day of you doing this, but it's only an hour. So recently Abigail is like, well, why are you tying me up? Is it safety for me or safety for you? And he's like, it's safety for me. So we have William giving Abigail this, or we have William giving Veronica this concoction. And what ends up happening is she ends up seeing a plethora of things that ultimately she had failed this study, and that ultimately William was going to shoot her and all kinds of evil-ish like things. Eventually, William slaps her with water and she wakes out of it. William asks her, well, what did you see? She tells him everything, and ultimately, the reason why William gave her this concoction is he assumes at some point that he wanted to drill into her that when going into this, she needs to be able to continue fighting tired, exhausted, cold, hot, whichever, and also if there was ever someone who ever could have this concoction and use it on her, she could still fight out of it or work out being able to not feel prey to this concoction, which she never will. But it's eventually just showing that this girl will have this concoction to use it on others. So we ultimately have it to where we have William and Veronica staking out this diner that ultimately William has noticed a lot of girls going missing via this location, and recently a lot of these girls end up being put on milk cartons somewhere or gone missing. So ultimately, William has narrowed down where all these girls have been going missing, and he found it. He found out that it was here. So ultimately, it seems like William has done a lot of detail or did a lot of investigating through this diner and has found out some numerous things about a couple boys that have consistently gone to this diner to get milkshakes. Because it seems like this place only sells milkshakes, and that's all it sells, because, well, milkshakes or pancakes, it seems. So we have it to where Veronica goes and notices that Jennifer, one of the boys' girlfriends, is there. And William mentions, yeah, like, this girl has been with Shane, one of the boys, since they were 14. And, like, this girl has been his cover for I don't know how long. And but these guys don't actually like women, bizarrely. That's why they usually hunt them down, because they're cold-hearted, like, people that just kill people. And recently, like, some of them have had covers or had a good alibi because they're all together going somewhere. So as the boys leave, Veronica goes and gets some intel on Jennifer. And Jennifer kind of mentions some stuff about her boyfriend, and recently it feels like she's very unsure about her relationship. Veronica goes in here and, like, mentions that, like, oh yeah, I'm all ears. I want to hear everything that you have to say. Ultimately, since Veronica's a new girl, she asked Jennifer, like, which shakes are good here. And Jennifer goes, like, well, like, I'm a very vanilla girl. And Veronica goes, it's like, oh no, like, you're better than that. Come on. So Veronica is trying to butter Jennifer up and to try to squeeze information out of her so she can get to know things about her target. And so reasonably, once Jennifer kind of releases that knowledge and mentions some stuff about her relationship, we cue Veronica going, yeah, like, I got something out of her, good. And then ultimately she walks out. Ultimately, it seems that most of the time within this movie, it seems to be raining a lot. But there are times where it seems like it's not raining everywhere. Because there's sometimes when you have Abigail and all the boys by a car, and it's raining everywhere else but where they actually are. Which I'm like, okay, what? Like, so wait a minute, did they only have, like, sprinklers during certain places of the? Did they have a trench or something over them so they didn't get hit with rain because it was actually raining in that setting? Hmm. Because ultimately you have one of the guys talking about, hey, let's get this girl out of the rain, and she doesn't have one drop of rain yet on her. And then, of course, it also, like, stops raining at some. So yeah, it's. And it also, in the latest setting, it doesn't look like there was one drop of rain anywhere. But it's a moot point. There are so many setting changes that probably happened during this movie that like maybe they just had to make do with whatever weather they had for this movie. It's probably me complaining about like, well, hey, yeah, like there was raining in some spot. You can't control the weather when you're doing a movie. You can't. You just have to deal with whatever's going on. So they ultimately have it to where Veronica is ultimately going to share a bed with William. And ultimately because what she does is she gets into the shower and then ultimately mentions to William, "Hey, can I share a bed with you?" And William's like, "Well, don't you already have a bed?" And she's like, "Well, I'm cold." She's coming up with any reason to get closer to William, and so William is just like, "Okay, fine." So Veronica gets next to William, and Veronica ultimately mentions, it's like do you find me attractive? And William says like, who wouldn't find you attractive? And Veronica goes like, well, like you're my trainer, how about you train me? I'm like, oh my god, she is hitting on him right now. Like probably there were some moments before all this, but like definitely now, like you could like cement that like she's hitting on him. And but this doesn't go anywhere because William had married a woman and lost her, and so ultimately he is, I guess, maybe not wanting to be entangled with his work, so to speak. He's not wanting to mix business and pleasure, if you know what I mean. And because reasonably, if she ever were to really actually die, he would feel horrible about it. Or maybe he already had married the previous girl that he was with and trained and whatever, and maybe that's a story that we didn't know. So, going on to this, we have it to where eventually Veronica goes and is consistently at this milkshake place. So eventually we get to where Alexander Ludwig, who plays Jameson, who eventually approaches said Veronica, ultimately taking her milkshake and sipping the rest of it. Ultimately, Veronica mentions like, well, like, was that good for you? And he's like, well, I've had better. Because ultimately he's really playing coy with this girl and like, yeah, like um ultimately asking her like, hey, what are you doing Saturday night? Ultimately Veronica says like, well, like uh, I'm gonna clean my hair, or she's gonna dry her hair, or wet her hair, or something. It's gonna do something with her hair. And Jameson says, no, you're gonna do that on Friday night because Saturday night you're going with me. You're going on a date. And ultimately, Veronica goes along with this. She's like, okay, sure, like whatever you say. Ultimately she asks him like, hey, where are we going? He's like, we're going to another world, which is very cryptic. And so she's just like, okay, well, something about you is fascinating, so I guess I'll go along with all this in her head. But she knows, she's like, yeah, I'm gonna get you. Because ultimately Veronica, when going into this diner originally, she goes and is seemingly grabbed by some other guy in the bathroom but ultimately she takes him down, and William comes in there into the bathroom behind her and mentions, like, yeah, like, you're going to tell nobody that you saw us here, and you're also going to tell that you, like, if anybody sees you and you look hurt, tell anyone that you fell. Like, if anything, you mess with my girlfriend and you made a mistake. So reasonably, we have here Veronica going along with this whole scenario. We have Jameson picking up every single one of these boys, ending up picking up Danny, Shane, and Nelson. Danny is really a odd duck. He kind of feels much more like a Jerry Lewis to me, kind of like dancing around to old music, and like he's just kind of like really like he has a lot of like energy. Like I feel like you can like everything about him like feels so like interesting, and he sticks out. We ultimately have Shane, who is again having the having a girlfriend, Jennifer. And really, there's not much about this guy. We ultimately have Nelson, who has I believe a weird thing going on with his mother at some points, where it seems like she's giving him ice cream, and ultimately he's going to leave for the night and take his ice cream with him, but also take a baseball bat. So we have all the people collected, and basically now Jameson is going after Veronica to take her to a place in the middle of nowhere in the woods. So eventually, Veronica meets all the boys. They all come out of the car to introduce themselves to her. And recently, she's like, "Oh, why are all these boys here? Like, is there going to be girls here as well?" And Jameson's like, "Well, of course there will be. Like, if anything, the rest of the people are gonna come eventually." So Veronica acknowledges all this, knowing that it's a bull-faced lie, but she's not going to tell all of them that. So reasonably, Veronica goes along, and as they're driving along, uh, we have Nelson, who has this bat, and recently there's also another joke going on about about Danny, and I believe his axe that he has that he calls a girl's name, mentioning when Veronica is mentioning about other girls, like Danny's like, well, yeah, I can't wait to have you meet this one other girl of mine. She's very sharp. She's very she'll really stick to you. She'll like all these weird, interesting metaphors to an axe that'll be coming at some point. So Nelson eventually gets out, like sticks his head or half of his body out of the car to nail mailboxes with a bat. Swings at him pretty hard, knocks him down. Ultimately, we have Veronica, who gets the top part of her body out of the car as well to swing at these mailboxes. It seems like she kind of just like preps the bat as like a punting kind of thing to smack these mailboxes, and the first time around it doesn't work, but the second time she nails it. So we ultimately have it to where, and I'm sure that was a really hard scene to do. So it's not like she wasn't strong enough or whatever. It was just that was probably a really hard scene to try to do. So Veronica and all the boys end up in the forest, and Veronica is asking, it's like, well, hey, where is everyone else? It seems like are we the first one here? And Jameson goes, we're always the first ones here. So Veronica eventually sees a bunch of beat up or old furniture, and they all start to sit down on all these furnitures, recliners, sofas, chairs that are all severely beaten up. And the thing that they end up doing next is they all start to play seemingly truth or dare. And so reasonably, Veronica has a cocktail of sorts that she is going to seemingly give every single boy during this game. The only person that she doesn't give it to is Jameson because he won't drink. So during this game, Veronica is asking Jameson a question about one of the girls that he should know of because she knows that he killed her, or one of them did. And so ultimately, Jameson is trying to answer without answering it. So there are also, at one point, one of the guys, I believe it's Nelson, who eats a worm, and really you have like these interesting stuff that ends up going on through this truth or dare. Eventually, Jameson kisses Veronica, and ultimately, Veronica has her hands tied behind her with a belt. And so ultimately, the very last thing that they pull out is the word that says die. And so Veronica's like, die, what does that mean? As if she doesn't know. So Jameson mentions, like, okay, well, I'm going to give you a prep time of 5 minutes, and you're going to run, and we're going to hunt you, because that's what we do. So you're going to run out there, and we are going to eventually track you down, because recently, like, out of the four of us, should be able to find you, because if anything, we'll be able to cover like 90 degrees seemingly in any which way. And like Jameson kind of does the math all in his head. So Veronica ends up having her quickly, after seemingly looking very defenseless and so shocked, she's like, I can't believe this. So she ultimately screams. Ultimately, all the other boys scream, and ultimately, they're like, "You realize we're in the middle of nowhere. Like, no matter how hard you scream, no one's gonna hear you." And so, reasonably, like, go ahead and run. We're gonna find you, and we're gonna take you out. So, eventually, Veronica just immediately, the first thing that she does as she starts to run is easily like get untied from this belt and just like starts running. But then eventually at some points she does stop and kind of wipe her eyes of her fake tears and kind of gets ready and gears up for how much she is going to have to run, or eventually like figure out what is the game plan around this forest, so eventually like she won't be caught easily. So eventually, here's the thing: the cocktail that Veronica was passing around was laced with the stuff that Veronica had taken herself, that William had given her previously. And so now every single one of these boys are eventually, while running, are going to see their deepest, darkest fears. And I was like, okay, Like, I think the first time I watched this, I didn't quite connect to this at first. I was like, okay, what does this mean? I was like, what is going on here? And I think I was getting this portion confused because, like, okay, why is it that there's like, why is there seemingly an affair going on in here? What is the why is there panda masks going on here with two guys? Why is there uh, why is there ski mask guys circling around uh, and this and that? Ultimately, like I kind of got to that point in the very first review, but there was also some murky waters kind of trudging through that as well. So, anyways, going into this, so eventually we have it to where at first we have Danny, who seems while running is eventually going to see two men and seemingly panda like masks, reminding me of a movie called Funhouse that I'm still not sure is quite out yet, but there's this reality show movie called Funhouse where you have like the poster of it is this like panda like mask and it has like this bat on the side that has like nails coming out of it. It's a pretty awesome movie. I desperately eventually want to watch that again. But it's just the fact of like, well, I don't know if that movie's actually released anywhere yet or where exactly can you find it if it hasn't been released yet. So, going into this, Veronica running, Danny succumbing to the fear of guys wearing panda masks. Eventually, Veronica finds Danny with this panda with seeing these panda masks. Veronica doesn't see it, but Danny sees it. And basically, what ends up happening is Veronica is starting to hit Danny, and really, Danny is not seeing Veronica. He's seeing these people in panda masks hitting him. And so, really, eventually, Veronica just beats the crap out of him and then axes him in the chest. So that leads to Nelson. Nelson eventually is again running through the forest with his bat, and so reasonably, he is eventually getting to the aspect of having this like bright-ish like lights being spotted onto him, and then all of a sudden there's a bunch of guys with black shirts and pants and ski masks on that are circling around him, and really Nelson is feeling outnumbered, and so Veronica eventually is circling around Nelson like these ski masked individuals are, and eventually she's popping in and hitting him and popping out, popping in, popping out, and repetitiously hitting him to the point where eventually she doesn't kill him with the bat. What she ends up doing is after Nelson falls to the ground, Veronica takes a rock and smashes it over Nelson's head in a very Saw-like fashion. So we end up having it be Shane. Shane also had again drank the cocktail, and so reasonably Shane, I believe, doubles back to where all that weird furniture is, and Shane eventually sees Jennifer, his girlfriend, and we have to where Jennifer is revealing a secret to Shane because right before Shane gets back, Jameson intercepts Jennifer and they end up kissing. And so when Shane doubles back, he ultimately notices this and he's just like, what's going on here? And ultimately, Jennifer mentions uh, that Jennifer and Jameson had a fling together, but it was well before they were even together. And ultimately, Jameson mentions like, well, no, like we've done this plenty of times. Like, so ultimately Shane goes and is in the middle of this, and he's like, oh my god. We ultimately have Jameson who was mentioning like, well, I think it's about time that we need to tell her, Shane, like what we do here. And so ultimately Jameson tells tells Jennifer the truth, that they kill people, that ultimately Shane is not actually in love with Jennifer. And Shane says like, no, I do actually love Jennifer. So we have to where eventually Shane beats up on Jameson for telling her everything, but also placating to this affair. And then eventually, Shane is eventually going to tell her the truth, and but also tell her that he really does love her. So eventually, we get to the point where Shane is choking Jennifer, and at some point, we find out that this whole affair thing is actually Shane's greatest fear. In that this was all a ruse, that this was all a lie. And it's like, oh my god. Ultimately, Veronica overpowers Shane and eventually does kill him. And there goes yet another one bites the dust. So we eventually have Jameson who is going around and trying to find this girl, but ultimately he finds his friends instead. He ultimately finds Danny axed in the chest, and he's like, wow, this girl's impressive. So we ultimately have it to where Jameson is still kind of running around. Veronica is running to find Jameson, and eventually they do stumble upon one another. And remind you, Jameson is the only one that did not take the fear cocktail. So reasonably, he is not going to see his greatest fear being played out with Veronica present. So ultimately, we have Jameson who is really at this point almost in love with Veronica. He's basically asking to marry her. He's like basically when she is seemed to be getting prepared for Jameson. Jameson says, "You know what? Hey, like, whoa, 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 whoa! Don't fight me now. Like, if anything, like, catch your breath. Like, I'll give you all the time that you need. And so, like, if anything, like, hey, like, before we fight here, like, I'm gonna give you all the time that you need to get prepared for me." And while they're doing this, they're asking one another questions. Ultimately, ultimately Jameson asks her like, how did it feel to kill all of his friends? And she's like, it felt fantastic. And Jameson is like, oh my god, like I think I'm in love. And so Veronica mentions to Jameson, it's like, hey, did you ever cheat with Jennifer while she was with Shane? It's like, yeah, Jameson mentions and confesses, yeah, I did that like a number of times. Like, why did you ask? It's like, well, Veronica mentions that this was Shane's greatest fear, was you cheating or having an affair with his girlfriend. So eventually, Jameson is starting to get a little ticked off at this point, and so ultimately Jameson asks Veronica, it's like, well, did you catch your breath? Like, are you good? And ultimately Veronica's like, yep. I popped my neck. I snapped all my fingers and I'm good. Because ultimately what happened is that she had to go into the water and like straighten her broken nose. I was like, oh my god. And so that's the reason why she was so winded and she was so tired, because she had to reset her broken nose. Because while playing into that scene, Shane was like punching her in the face, so she broke her nose by doing that. So we have it to where there is like this, like, interesting enough. You have like Veronica, like where her fists are at. I was like, okay, this is like, it seems like her fists are like really far out there, and like I'm not critiquing anyone's stance, because recently I'm not a UFC fighter, but like it was just kind of like weird how people's like stances were. But ultimately, you had Veronica having some good licks. You had Jameson has some good licks in there. Like, it was very back and forth. Uh, but then eventually, we had this moment earlier on in this movie where Veronica had to choke out William, um, basically showcasing how hard she needed to choke somebody. And like basically to the point of snuffing the life out of someone. Because ultimately, William was doing that to Veronica so Veronica could figure out a way to break out of it, and she didn't, so she passed out. And so when William told her to choke her, or choke him, um, he also just like really passed out as well. So eventually, Veronica gets some good licks on Jameson, and then eventually chokes him out to the point to where he doesn't get back up. Veronica ends up giving the flask to Jameson to pour in the elixir, and then eventually we have Veronica, seemingly, I would guess, uh, very much build a little bit of a thing where Jameson is now in a noose. He's getting seemingly hung in the middle of the forest. And what ends up happening is that Jameson is going to, instead of being this overly confident person, he is going to beg for his life. Which I'm like, whoa, like, man, this is probably the most confident out of everybody. And now this girl is going to break him and, like, make him be this guy that is ultimately gonna say that he's gonna give her whatever he wants, or give her whatever she wants so he can be free. And the only thing that she wants from him is his life, which is awesome. And basically, she asks, like, well, are you going to beg me? Are you going to beg from anyone? Are you going to beg from God? And Jameson says, no, I'm not going to do that. So eventually, we all of a sudden see every single woman or every single person that Jameson has ever killed seemingly in the background haunting Jameson, to the point where this is really scaring Jameson. And there was also a story earlier uh, about Jameson talking about a bunny, on how reasonably he went hunting with his father at one point and had took down a bunny, but ultimately it wasn't enough to kill it. It was suffering. And so Jameson's father made him kill the bunny because you should never leave an animal to suffer. So reasonably, now Veronica is making Jameson suffer and be on trial for what he has done. And ultimately, to where Jameson ultimately is now just going to let himself go and let himself be hung. And then eventually we have William coming from seemingly out of the brush somewhere, and mentioning, like, if she's okay, and ultimately, uh like, that's a wrap for this one. So recently we have William and Veronica going back to that diner to eat pancakes. I guess maybe that's probably Veronica's, like, victory meal or her favorite meal. So recently, like, that's her prize for otherwise another successful day. Here's the one thing that I would have loved to have a backstory on. I wish William would have mentioned to us about his previous woman that he was with. Great conclusion to this movie, and that would have been a heartfelt, like, send off. To otherwise tell us that, like, the real reason why William does this is because of the wife that he had previously lost. Or maybe the fact that he trained a girl before all this and she ended up dying from some case. Again, that would have been a very interesting story to maybe conclude this whole thing. It didn't need to be shown any time earlier than that. You could have waited to the very ending of maybe every single time that William ends up having a good case with her, that ultimately William will tell Veronica a little bit about William at some points. You could have had a montage of maybe her winning a bunch of cases and William, like, consistently giving her little things about himself and telling her the truth, and eventually it gets to the point to where at the very end of this movie we find out that William's previous wife had been had died from a case that she had been on, or had just gone missing and found dead or something like that. Like, that would make this movie just an amazing way to end all this, because you never really find anything out about William, and you barely know much about Veronica within this movie. It's like, I guess they're just whoever that they need to be in these situations, and I think that is the real interesting part about this movie. So I'm going to get out of here. At the end of the day, hopefully someone will find this review. Someone will enjoy it, because I enjoyed this movie. I enjoyed every time I watch it, and I'm so happy that I ended up finding this film at some point. Because, like, you know what, like, maybe there's something going to be about this movie. And then when I watched, I'm like, wow, this is like a way better movie than I thought it was going to be. So luckily for me, Final Girl. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.